There's been no regulation or over-regulation. Now, Vakar, you mentioned that there is no regulation in India. Actually, that's not true. The DPCO, Pharmaceuticals Drug Price Control Order, is very, very strong. And they have, I think, largely been instrumental in keeping the prices of drugs and pharmaceuticals down in India. So we do have fairly strong central control in terms of the DPCO, which everyone observes. Very few manufacturers will violate that because it's legally challengeable. So I'll just basically make the only point that I think it's only in the 90s, it's only in the late 90s that some kind of semblance of regulatory system started emerging in Pakistan. When we talk to manufacturers in our visit there, one of the problems was this, that the government does not sort of ask them what they should do or not do. In India, there's a very long stakeholder consultations in most decisions which we take because of the political and the federal system. But most of the manufacturers complain that no one really listens to what they are. The government doesn't really look into what their issues are. But otherwise, the structure, except for the size being so different, is very similar. A few, larger of course in India, a few large manufacturers, a very large number of small manufacturers. That's typical structure in both countries. Okay, now some trends in Indo-Pak pharmaceutical trade. Again, this is all Comtrade database, and you can see from here that obviously there has been a huge imbalance in terms of surplus in favor of India. Very little that we really import from Pakistan, and you can see there was a big, it's only after 2009 that some kind of importing, India starts importing something from Pakistan. Again, largely because the regimes were such, the trade regime was not really in terms of the positive list, and border trade was allowed only very recently, and you really can't expect two countries so close to be trading by ship. So all these factors, not surprising that very little trade, very little exports from Pakistan to India. Now, in these kind of low levels, I would not go too much into these growth rates because the base levels that which are looking at are so small, everything seems large. But again, the volumes are extremely small in terms of, something that makes difference. Now, this is the part we want to stress a bit. Regional trade agreements. Now, we have SAFTA on the one hand, and then we have, in the case of Pakistan, the Pakistan-China Free Trade Agreement, which was done very quickly actually. Basically very rare for RTAs to start, being in operation 1 year after they're signed. Very quickly they were, and it may be, there's some other issues that we will talk about, but if you look at this one point here, share of items in India's negatives that Pakistan imports from China is almost 31%. I told you we're going to look at the negative list. We're going to look at, does the removal of MFN, and what I now know is a much better word, NDA, non-discriminatory, agreement. I think that's a much nicer word. Maybe the word should adopt that. But removal of that is going to make a severe difference. And I'm looking at this particular issue that items in India's negative list that Pakistan imports from China, almost 31%. We broke it down into what we import, compared the two lists, and so on and so forth. Now look at this. India has actually been trading, in a sense, pharmaceuticals with Pakistan for a long time. Yet you see China's exports, or China exports to Pakistan almost twice that of India. Now, is there a problem? No, it doesn't mean India should be exporting more, but is something holding it back? And we say, yes, we think that it is. China is the only Asian country which features in Pakistan's top 10 import partners. Now, given that much of the generic market or production markets are shifting to Asia, this is rather surprising. And Pakistan imports of pharmas from India are much greater than Pakistan's imports of pharmaceuticals from China, from India. So that is pretty clear. Now, what we do is, in our database, what we do is classified, as you know, pharma into various parts. We looked at bulk intermediates, what are called APIs, active pharmaceutical ingredients, and of course formulations, which is the final product. This is of course the description of the database that we filled. Now, Vakar, you looked only at 30, which is of course possible, but we have not looked at, pharma is a sector where you really can't look only at the at the 30 division level, because there are a whole lot of some people who feel even section 15 should be part of it, because it's a mixture of chemicals, ingredients and the formulations. So we've actually looked at 3 sectors using the definition used in India. At 6-digit level, we looked at 28, 29 and 30, because all these really together make up what we might call the pharma industry. Now what we did is we looked at two trade indicators. Again, a lot of pinch of salt. I'm a trade theorist, so I've got to do this, right? But a lot of pinch of salt on these because the numbers are so small. And we looked at what is a well-known index. The logic is that typically trade between similar countries like India and Pakistan would normally be of what is called the intra-industry variety, trade in similar products. So the usual kind of Balasa kind of indicators don't make sense, because the theoretical underpinnings of that is the Herxhausen theorem. We think it should be more of intra-industry trade, and therefore other measures give a better idea of what's happening in trade. And we looked in fact at 2 possible measures. One is the Grubel-Lloyd index. Now this itself has a lot of problems with the index. There's aggregation bias, and then there is a trade imbalance bias. You can't get rid of all, but we tried to get rid of at least the aggregation bias to a certain extent by looking at what we call the GL prime. And the GL prime is one which sort of adjusts for the aggregation bias. It's up there on the screen. And we then calculated the levels of inter-industry trade between 2009 and 2012. And you can see it's very small. You know, even at the highly aggregated simple Grubel-Lloyd index, the first row, it stays around 0.25, 0.30, Now this 0.13 is a huge blip. And here is really the trade imbalance. That's the one year when suddenly there was a huge dip in India's imports in Pakistan. The trade imbalance became huge. Actually, India exported a lot to Pakistan. So that's really a blip in the thing. It's really not an indicator. But otherwise, you look, it sort of stays around 0.25. It doesn't really move very much from there. About the same can be said about the adjusted Grubel-Lloyd index with GL prime, which stays around at about 0.12 and then goes up till about 0.27 towards the end of that, showing some increase in inter-industry trade once you remove the trade imbalance, the aggregation bias. Now, we then separately calculated it for the 2 sectors. Again, bulk drugs are not necessarily substitutes for formulations. Typically, inter-industry trade would include in the same calculation items which are substitutes either in consumption or production. Bulk drugs and formulations are really not substitutes. They're 2 different things. One is really an input into the other. So we separately calculate the Grubel-Lloyd index for the 2, and that's what it shows us is that not surprisingly, inter-industry trade in formulations is very small, because India has a huge advantage here. And it's only in bulk and intermediates, that is what we call active pharmaceutical ingredients, where the inter-industry trade seems to be of some, not very large, but does show up. So that's one of the things that we find, that most of the trade that's taking place is really in these what are called bulk drugs and intermediates. Now, the other thing we looked at is what is called trade indicator. Now this is something again trade theorists like us do when we calculate trade complementarity index. Let me not go in detail of the index. It has some fairly desirable and some undesirable properties, but what it does is it says if you are exporting 10% of pharma products and Pakistan is importing 10% of its pharma products from you, then you're in good shape. There's a reasonable amount of complementarity. And so obviously the measure would be 100 for high complementarity and 0 for low complementarity. And you look at it you can do this, India's exports to Pakistan, Pakistan's imports from India, and you can also reverse it and look at India's exports to Pakistan and Pakistan's exports to India. So you can do it for both Pakistan and India, and these are the 2 indices which we show over here, calculated for Pakistan first and then for India, and both tell about the same picture, that there is some complementarity, not a lot. There is further possibility of exploiting complementarity. It's about 67% for Pakistan, about 72% if you look at it from India's point of view. And so there is a possibility of further exploiting the complementarities that are there between these 2 countries. Now, this is the part you want to do, right, Devyani? Okay, Devyani is the first presentation, so so listen carefully. And she's going to present the section on Indo-Pakistan China trade dynamics. Come.
Thank you so much, sir. So before we actually started going into issues of India-Pakistan trade in pharmaceuticals, a point that was actually highlighted was that Pakistan imports more pharmaceutical items from China than from India. So if you have a look at the trend of Pakistan's pharmaceutical imports from China and India, we see that in 2009 there was actually a switch or a shift in Pakistan's pharmaceutical imports from India towards China, and thereafter if you see the imports have been rising from China. So this could perhaps kind of point towards trade diversion because of the fact that the PCFTA or the Pakistan-China Free Trade Agreement was signed in the year 2009. And so what we did to examine the issue of trade diversion was to match the zero tariff list and the preferential list under the PCFTA with the negative and the sensitive list that Pakistan maintains for India under SAFTA. And surprisingly, what we found was that Pakistan does not give any favorable treatment to China, none at all, just because of the fact that the items in the lists of both the free trade agreements are so very different. So continuing with this, another question that arises is that if Pakistan is importing more pharmaceutical items from China, is it that the Chinese pharmaceuticals are more competitive? And to answer that question, what we did was we calculated unit values and to assess the competitiveness of Indian and Pakistani pharmaceutical items. So unit values are just simply the trade value divided by the quantity traded. Now this might not be a foolproof method, but just as an indicator, I think it suffices. So the three main points that actually emerge from this table that firstly in the year 2012, so what you see in this table are the top 13 Pakistan imports from China, their share, and the third column lists the country which has a greater unit value. Now unit values can also be sort of used as proxies for prices. So the first one that emerges is that in the year 2012, out of the 13 items, there were 11 items in which the Indian prices were much greater than the Chinese prices. So what can be argued is that the very fact that Indian pharmaceutical items have prices greater than that of China, retaining these items in the negative list is actually needless, because it would anyway mean that India would have to compete with China once these items are out of the negative list. Secondly, the fear of Indian pharmaceutical items flooding the Pakistani pharmaceutical market is also a bit misplaced, since free competition would eventually lead to the existence of the cheapest and the best quality drugs. And the potential gains from free trade, we are all aware, are quite apparent, such as lower costs, better technology, improved R&D, etc. Lastly, if these items are removed from the negative list, competition would actually lead to lower unit values in India also, and a major advantage of that would be the increase in consumer surplus for the consumers in both the countries. As far as industry insights are concerned, in the stakeholder consultations that we had at Karachi, it was heartening to know that few of the players are very keen to integrate with the Indian pharmaceutical market. They were very supportive of the MFN or the non-discriminatory market access being granted to India. And they also realized the benefits or the gains that would take place as trade would be liberalized. And these are firstly the gain from the Indian research and development experience. Secondly, the possibility of direct trade rather than indirect trade, which would lead to a huge saving of transport costs. Thirdly, larger market access for the Pakistan pharmaceutical companies. And fourthly, a better drug regulatory framework would also result if trade is liberalized between the two countries, and which the stakeholders said was pretty weak in Pakistan at the moment. Now the other side of the story is the apprehension of the smaller players. They have a fear of competition, and they also fear that there will be an influx of Indian pharmaceutical items once the negative list is done away with. They also remarked that they needed time to kind of establish themselves and prepare for competition. So one option to actually combat any kind of influx of pharmaceutical items into the industry is to incorporate trigger mechanisms in the system itself. That would be one way in which influx could actually be avoided if the need be. Now we've talked about trade issues. What follows as trade progresses or advances is foreign direct investment or FDI. Now the link between the two arises because of the fact that now the theory has recognized that FDI and trade can be substitutes and complements. If simply put, FDI is just another way of doing trade. Even the internalization theory of FDI remarks that FDI is actually the last stage of trade through which companies or countries engage together. In the context of pharmaceuticals, if we see the FDI policies in both the countries, they are extremely liberal. India allows 100% FDI through automatic route in greenfield investments. And recently, the Indian government also gave a nod to 100% FDI through the automatic route in existing companies. The same holds for Pakistan as well. 100% foreign equity is allowed in the manufacturing sector, along with a lot of other benefits. Now, the trade policies are pretty liberal, but if you see the foreign involvement, there's quite a lot of difference. In India, MNCs have about a 30% market share, whereas in Pakistan, MNCs have about half the market share. And the top 20 national companies in India actually have about more than 50% share of the Indian pharmaceutical industry. Now to conclude, I'll just leave you with three major points. So the negative list should be done away with, because if Pakistan can give market access to China, there's no point in not giving market access to India too. In fact, competition would just solve all the problems. And in case, and if there's any kind of influx of pharmaceutical items, a wise thing would be to incorporate trigger mechanisms to restrict trade if the need arises. Secondly, according to a few reports, Pakistan pharmaceutical items are much cheaper than their Indian counterparts. So if trade is enhanced between the two countries, Pakistan would also have much more market access to India with the liberalized trade. And lastly, the advantages of liberalization would accrue to both the countries, such as lower costs, more R&D, improvement in production methods, etc. But definitely the gain to the Pakistan pharmaceutical industry would be much more than to India. So these are the points, I think, which make a case for liberalizing trade between India and Pakistan in the pharmaceuticals industry. Thank you.
Thank you, Manoj and Devjani. Oh, Manoj, you are.
Thank you. Just want to conclude. I think the overall point one is trying to make is, this is probably one sector which one really doesn't know why it's so restricted. For two reasons. You know, there's one thing, there's lots of things in the longer paper which people can read. One of the things which was surprising to me when I looked at is that the duties on the intermediates imported to Pakistan are higher than for the final products. Now that's what we call a reverse, what we call a inverted tariff structure. So actually, if you reduce the duties on intermediates, which is where all the trade is taking place, you actually increase protection for the final product. So that's one of the surprising things. We have a similar thing happening in India and other areas like electronics. Same inverted duty structure. That's something which the authorities should look into as a micro issue, as to in fact increase protection. The second point I think one wants to make is that as a CBM in trade, as a confidence building measure trade, this may be a good sector to start with, because it's unlikely, given the dominance and establishment of India in the world generic market, particularly in developed countries, that there will be a huge sudden switch away from their standard markets to Pakistan. On the other hand, Pakistan has a lot to gain, particularly in the context of foreign investment. Now, we heard from the manufacturer in Pakistan that the biggest gain to them could be in terms of collaboration. Now, FDI is not going to happen in a hurry. Let's be very clear about that. But the point I think we are trying to stress in the paper is that ultimately you do have to look at it, because these are not two different animals. Trade something, FDI is another way of doing trade. At some point of time, you have to look into what is your foreign investment policy, particularly between the two countries, and it helps to exploit complementarities through foreign investment. That's really what the best thing that foreign investment does. And the last point which I would like to try and conclude with is that many of the big manufacturers in Pakistan said that the biggest problem to them today in exporting to other countries, to the more developed markets, where the markets are much larger, is FDA approval. Now, India already has approved FDA approval testing laboratories in India, which Pakistan doesn't. So, lot of R&D. The only sector in India where R&D is very high.